Our special guest is Professor Paul Rogers, State University of Utah. Am I right?
Pretty close.
And I would like to ask Professor Kuzbak to introduce him. Yeah?
Hello everyone. I'm actually no professor. It's first thing. And second, Paul is from Utah State University.
This is close.
It's pretty close. But anyway, it's great to have you here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Paul, who is actually a long-term friend and colleague of mine. We have met in Utah State a long time ago. So he's a researcher, teacher. What else? You can introduce yourself actually. So go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's it for Czech. It's going to go all English. I'm very grateful that you will hear me out in English. I really am. I truly am. So, yeah, I am a, I don't know, I have to look at my notes. Sometimes it's not clear to me what I am. I'm a biogeographer and ecologist. When those two things mix, I don't know what it makes, but it certainly makes me. I work at Utah State University, and I run a nonprofit through the university called the Western Aspen Alliance. Let's see if I can do this. No, I failed. There we go. We got it. Okay. And I work in the College of Natural Resources in the Department of Environment and Society and the Ecology Center, which runs across several colleges and centers around ecological topics. That's pretty confusing to you, so I'll just leave it right there. My task today is to talk to you about a very wide-ranging subject, the biogeography of forests, but specifically about sort of natural management and management trends in forests. I hope there might be some applicability to Central European forests, but my secret task is to ask more questions than information that I give, to prompt you, to tempt you into thinking, as opposed to providing answers for you. This is the famous Pando forest. If you don't know what that is, I'll get to it later. This is an infrared photograph. It's a very expensive photograph this man, Jay Bruner, makes, and he donated a small part of the profits to this organization. This is quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides, and I'm going to dangle that out there for you and revisit. If you don't know what that is, as botanists, you should, because it's world famous. So here's where I'm headed. A roadmap of this talk. I'm going to start really big, and a continental overview of forests and forest diversity. Then I'm going to talk about forest types specifically, sort of in the United States, favoring the western United States where I live and work. And then disturbance in climate and the interaction of these two things, what we know and what we don't know. I'll give you a hint, there's a lot we don't know. And then forests and trees. Are they the same thing? And then I really want to focus on the inefficient forest. And I'll give up a little bit of my punchline. In my personal opinion and all my lifetime of research, I think we've focused a lot on efficient forests. And maybe that is the wrong path. So, forests at a world scale, you've all seen maps like this, how they're distributed. The climate has a big effect on things. They may be shuffling around a little bit as we get to climate change. But in addition to being an ecologist and biogeographer, I came out of something called cartography, which is a word that's not used anymore. We just talk about, I work in GIS, right? The point of this slide is that these are well and good to give you broad trends, but the generalizations of mapping are almost always misconstrued and misunderstood. Where it points to certain types of forests in any zone, we get the idea that everything is uniform within that. and it's by far it is not, right? The level of generalization and the scale and adjustments made for vegetation are crucial. So this is just an overview, right? I think you're aware of that. I just want to lay a foundation for where I'm heading here. And so that's the caution there. Be very careful when you look at maps. They only give you a broad picture and you have to know exactly what they are trying to depict. So we start zooming in a little bit more and spilling our water. I have a tendency to over gesture. And we get to this generalized map. And this is really just a climate map. But it gives us maybe sort of a palette or a screen on which to start laying our map of where certain forests occur and where they don't. And you'll see right away that there's some broad trends here. You have a large Arctic zone, you have tropical zones, but you have this funny line that we're going to come back to more and more as this presentation comes on, as it moves forward. A different look at sort of this continental overview and give you some, I have to step out here, give you some sense of the distribution of forests within the 3 countries that make up North America. Right? So by far the most forest coverage in kilometers squared is in Canada, and also the largest percentage of the land mass of that country. Secondly would be Mexico in terms of percentage of cover, but not in terms of amount. It's a little bit smaller country, and then the United States. So only about 1/3 of the United States is actually forested. So keep that in mind when you see these big distribution maps. This whole area here has a huge population of human beings who have altered the forests and altered the landscapes tremendously. And now actually our forest area is increasing over the last 100 years. Because initially we depleted that, and I'll come back to that subject later as well. And so we have these typical things that you would see in a biogeography or climate vegetation kind of class that influence the distribution of forests, right? I want you to pay special attention to this bottom one here, right? Because that's where obviously we come in, all of us, and how we alter these systems and whether we are battling against them or we are working with them. Another look at this. You can tell I like maps, huh? This is something called ecoregions. Ecoregions are made up of a combination of vegetation, climate, and soil or substrate, otherwise known as parent material. And so those are a little bit finer scale, and we're trying to still get at what types of forests could live in what kind of places. Or non-forests. A huge section of the center of this country is not forested. Or just having riparian forests along streams, right? So something like this state here, Nebraska, may be 95% non-forested. It's farm fields with some forests along big and little streams, for the most part. What are forest types? Forest types, technically speaking, according to the Society of American Foresters, are the predominant tree cover. A fancier term is the plurality of tree stocking. So if there's 45% cover in this species and 33% in this species and some smaller amount in several other species, we call it a forest type in the highest cover of species, right? And then we have, again, these sort of climatic zones here. We're still kind of weighing heavily toward climate, but we see things starting to break up a little bit more here with this subtropical zone, a temperate zone, a pretty much non-forested zone with some special forests up there, and deserts and so on. And so we're breaking things up a little bit more. This Mediterranean scrub is pretty important over here, because you see it in the news a lot. It happens to catch fire, and you know what? It's supposed to catch fire. It is not a disaster. What's a disaster is the way we interact with it, right? These forests are meant to burn, just like in their namesake, forests surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. They're physiologically designed to burn. So let's get just a look-see for some of these with some photographs. I've heard Tony talking about Alaska. This is a boreal forest up near Fairbanks, Alaska. It's dominated by 2 different species of spruce, 2 species of birch, and 1 species of aspen. By the way, you'll see me favoring aspen quite a bit. I'll just give up the ghost there. That's my gig, as you could tell from the organization, the Western Aspen Alliance, and I'm pretty excited about that topic for a number of reasons. This is the Yukon River near Fairbanks. Huge, huge expanses of boreal forest. South of that, I said at the northern part of that huge non-forested zone in North America, into predominantly Canada, is something called the parklands, which tends to be single species, or maybe 2 species. Almost entirely pure aspen stands. So we have to question our idea of what is forest succession if only 1 species ever dominates. How are we going to define that now? Is it going to change over time to another species? Or is it functionally going to change in other ways? I don't know. I'm just the translator. These eastern deciduous forests, and I'm simplifying quite a bit, I don't spend a lot of time there, but they're highly complex, highly diverse. Up to 10 species of acer or maple alone, right? Oaks, maples, pines, spruce, fir, very complex forests, very colorful at this time of year, attract a lot of tourism just for people who want to drive around and take photos. And then we get into the alpine forest, where I spend a lot of time. This is from the Rocky Mountains. We have spruce, firs, and pines predominantly. Maybe 5 or 6 species. But then we got some forest types in quotes, in which they're pretty sparse, and they're naturally so. So we got to start thinking about how we define a forest. Is it a forest if the trees only cover 5% of the landscape? What about 10%? What about 25%? So this is a Pinus ponderosa. I think that's pronounced differently depending on how you pronounce your Latin. The other pronunciation, let's just say, sounds funny to me. I'll leave it at that. But these really widely dispersed forests. What is a forest? I want us to think a lot about that. And we're going to question ourselves here in a minute. This is a pinyon juniper, shortened as PJ, in a desert or cold desert environment. And this is Nevada, for example. You can distinguish the brighter colored juniper from the sort of duller colored pines there. It's a pine tree with 1 needle in its fascicle. If you're familiar with pine trees, the definition of a pine tree is that it has a fascicle and there's more than 1 needle. Whoops. So, I wish nature would fit our rules better. It's just a problem. I'm joking, of course. Also, the seeds from pine trees are edible. These one-leaf pines, Pinus monifila, or monophylo, depending on your pronunciation. And these junipers, and they live a long time, and they grow very slowly, and they only grow to about 3 or 4 meters in height, usually. Is that a forest? Maybe they're only, if you took an aerial view instead of an oblique angle, maybe it only covers 30% of the landscape here, aerially. It's dry, they grow slowly. Is that a forest? I think it is. And then we get into, I showed you forest types at a continental scale, and this is just at the country scale, but when we move down to a regional scale, things get pretty busy. We have a lot of forest types, right? Forest types, just the predominant cover of tree species. And we're still at a really huge scale here, right? So we have lots of dominant covers, lots of different forests. It gets pretty mixed up here, especially where the terrain becomes more complex. Where the terrain's complex, essentially climates can change in a matter of a couple of kilometers as you go up in elevation, or excuse me, down in elevation. So let's dig in, and I won't go too far down this lane, but even within a species, that they all behave the same way. This is something that I developed with some colleagues about 10 years, 15 years ago, thinking about aspen functional types. And they're stable and cereal aspen. So they look something like this. I alluded to it before in the Canadian parklands that there's only aspen throughout the duration of its life, and it doesn't succeed to another species. And it doesn't burn well. Aspen loves fire in reaction to fire, but it doesn't burn. Holy shit, another conundrum, really. Wait a minute, how does that work? Well, if it's a cereal system, the more conifers, the more flammable. As time goes on through succession, you've got a more flammable forest. When that thing burns, whether moderate intensity or high intensity, aspen go crazy and they flourish. I think we're aware of that with Populus tremula in Europe and across Asia. But what about this stable, so-called stable or pure or persistent type? Doesn't burn well and has a whole different ecological functionality. It's not dependent on fire at all to renew itself. It grows back in small groups and patches and individual stems. It has a very complex architecture. So we can use these things to help us perhaps manage these environments more judiciously, more effectively, if we can understand even the rudiments of their ecology. So we got these big landscape types, we've got ecological divisions, ecoregions, we have forest types getting finer scale, and then even within some forest types, we have the same dominant tree species behaving differently in different situations. So here we've transferred from just describing things in terms of what their composition is. Perhaps that's what botanists do. I don't know, you're going to have to tell me. We count all the species, and you could say the same for wildlife, you could say the same for some other fields too. And we add them up and they mean something. But how do they function? How do they interact? And so traditionally we say there's, you know, this dominance that I talked about in a forest type, and that's the end of it. We know the story. But I'm more interested in how they interact, how they function, so that we can manage the human side of things effectively. So now the sexy stuff. Destruction, death, and climate. It's really cool. Lots of stuff happens. We have a lot of fires in our area. This is from 2014. It's called the Twitchell Canyon Fire in the southern part of the state I live in, Utah. You see down here is pinyon juniper. Up here is that alpine environment with a mix of 3 or 4 conifers plus some aspen. Just getting some feel for how these things interact in big patterns, in broad patterns. As size and intensity increases, they become more infrequent, or they are less frequent. So big stand replacing events happen more rarely than more frequent disturbances, and smaller, less intense disturbances. The more annual precipitation, the higher the frequency of disturbance. So you could think of these as relatively dry and infrequent events, but very intense. You can think of these as relatively wet and smaller disturbance events. Perhaps only a few trees falling over, or small patches within a broader forest. So these patterns kind of help us start dissecting how the systems function in terms of the relationship between disturbance and climate. How that works, yeah. So another little bit deeper dive into disturbance. This is near Jackson, Wyoming. This is a landslide up on the hill here. Our one pine species, an aspen. You pull away all the earth and you start from zero in terms of plants. Well, it turns out aspen really love that kind of thing. You just take away all the competitors. Remember, they're growing from sprouts, from clones. They're genetically identical to at least one parent tree up here. And these just start popping up automatically from root systems underground without needing to germinate from seed. Pretty, God. Get away. Oh. Well, your whole table's wet now. I'm so sorry. So we have fast-acting disturbances. Fires, human forest treatments, this landslide here, wind events, frost events that can happen overnight, within an hour, very fast. And then we have a lot of slow-acting disturbance types, such as grazing, which is different than browsing. Grazing is eating herbaceous plants. Browsing is eating woody plants. Climate is happening slowly. Various pathogens and insects happen over time slowly, and they act in different ways and they interact in different ways. These things tend to not happen in a vacuum or solely individuals, right? They interact. For example, grazing and climate over time can cause denudation of landscapes and avalanches. So one can kind of lead to the other. This slow moving action here leads to a sudden event. Practically the definition of landscape ecology or disturbance ecology. Conversely, we can have fast-acting events happening alongside climate, which we're all talking about these days, and grouping up to completely change or alter vegetation communities, perhaps from a forest to a completely non-forested community. Or in the extreme example, to bring our friends the human beings into it, we plow out an area and we develop it. It's no longer a forest. Maybe it's a parking lot or a road or some kind of resort, a ski resort, or telephone lines, or all these things. Interacting events, fast and slow, happening at different scales, and definitely some human components involved here, which is where I get all excited and where I spent my time. This is an area on private property that's very large of an extremely wealthy person in southern Colorado. It's at approximately 3,000 meters elevation, and this used to be a forest. A forest fire burned through there in 2010, and there are so many elk. Cervus adelphus is the same, I believe, as the red deer in Europe in terms of species description. And there are even more on private land because they can be legally hunted on public land. So in this area that had a forest fire, which is very good and healthy for aspen, for example, and for many species in terms of renewal, there is essentially no forest. When we got out of our vehicles on this trip, we could smell the elk, like a cattle feedlot. And they're eating everything. Just to the left over here, you can't see it, is an exclosure with aspen growing inside it. What's really even more scary, so by the time we went here, about 10 years had gone by. This is roughly 8,000 hectare fire. And there was nothing growing back, and these wild animals were also eating conifers. This ponderosa pine tree, Pinus ponderosa, they were not regenerating either. So combining facts here, combining effects here, and humans kind of nudging it in the wrong direction to get into some complex situations in which we might be completely altering vegetation communities. And this is a pretty wild environment. This is tens of kilometers from any town and at high elevation. So it's not what you'd think of as a human-altered site, but we have a large role to play in how animals are managed, how plants are managed, Fires are managed or not managed. All of these interacting factors, we often go charging in without thinking about the connectivity of them. So I won't spend too much time in this, but I've been highly influenced by these folks and this idea of panarchy, or interacting disturbances, Gunderson and Holling. But basically systems take a long time to build up. There's some quick action or conversion, and then it starts to rebuild and reorganize and start this loop kind of over again. It's almost like traditional succession, although it gets more complex. Because you can have things spin off into alternative vegetation states, depending on, not always, but often on the amount of human influence on them. What I think is really cool, and I'm not going to go there very far because this is way out of our realm in this classroom and our specialties, but these affect, these kind of altered states and organizational patterns affect ecological and social systems, institutions, for example, like universities or governments. If you think of, in a simplified case, you know, a build-up and long stability and then some kind of instability in a government and a revolution and a rebuilding. And those social and ecological systems may interact at different scales. So here you have this kind of what's so-called R system, where things turn over very quickly, versus a K system, long-lived species that move slowly. But the similar patterns of interaction and rebuilding take place. So a little bit over toward the climate side of the disturbance climate formula. I like to compare these because they don't always mean the same thing. Precipitation and evaporation, or evapotranspiration. And to zoom in on that a little bit more, you'll see that these two areas here that has very high annual precipitation, but also high evaporation in the Canadian Rockies, northern Rockies of the United States. Conversely, in a tropical area, you have high precipitation and high evapotranspiration. I'm sorry, this was low evapotranspiration here. So these patterns, climate does not always, precipitation doesn't always determine everything. It's that interactive effect between temperature and precipitation. And so we need to kind of keep that straight in our head. It gets complex. And back to this line again, because this is crucial to understanding not only forest types, but vegetation broadly. This is the line, also known as the 100th meridian of longitude, in which evaporation on this side is higher than precipitation, except for the exception being on the west coast where there's high precipitation. So here there's more evaporation than precipitation for the most part. Here it's the other way around. So in terms of crops and growing things, we have to water here. We have to move water around to live there as human beings and to set up settlements. Here, much less so, if at all. So that's a crucial line to understand in terms of vegetation, in terms of community types, in terms of forest types, and in terms ultimately of managing them with ecological patterns in mind. Again, some visuals here on some different disturbances. This is a spruce beetle outbreak. I think you're familiar with that in this area. Different spruce species. We're very familiar with that now in Czechia, right? And it takes out not every tree, but it tends to, at least in our part of the world, based on diameter of trees, how big they are, how old they are, it tends to not take out the younger ones. I think that's a different pattern perhaps here in Czechia. This is kind of cool because here in the foreground is an avalanche, that, remnants of an avalanche about 10 years prior, maybe 15 years, where the avalanche of snow came down this way and rode off into here. And so here's all the old trees that are knocked down all around here and presumably into here. And here's the response of the vegetation. Again, aspen growing from clonal root system very quickly and responding to that. Forest fire in northern Arizona, you see a lot of these. If you look real close, there's some aspen growing in here, but this is only 1 or 2 years after the forest fire, so we wouldn't expect to see a lot coming back yet. And this is a forest fire. This is from Alaska as well. Again, it's a boreal forest. The events are very infrequent and very extreme. Very hot. All the vegetation is killed. But what I wanted you to focus on is, what about all this? Is that a disturbance? Is that kind of living with the forest and in the forest? No, matter of fact, they built a new house because the old one burned down. But these human disturbances are everywhere on our landscapes as well. More direct ones like this, and more indirect ones like manipulation of the animals I spoke about earlier. So, some forests are more resilient than others. You can tell, being vegetation people, that there's a lot of energy in this forest. There's a lot of biodiversity. There's a lot of moisture. That makes it resilient to climate change. There's kind of an ecological buffer there. At high elevation and at lower elevation, it would be drier. But in the middle, it's in pretty good shape. It can react pretty well. It has sort of some extra padding to react to changing climate or other disturbance events. They can respond pretty well. This one, not so much. This is a ghost forest. It's not going to come back. You can't have regeneration from aspen roots underground unless there's something alive above ground. This is low elevation, and it's intensive browsing alongside a warming climate. Did that die just because of the climate, or the combination of these things? And did the animals just occur naturally, or are we manipulating them in some way? We've removed most of the predators, for example. That probably had some effect. We also have domestic livestock in these areas. So we have systems that, I use this metaphor a lot, if at the edge of the table is kind of like a cliff, and we have climate change being the cliff, do we keep nudging a system, a forest system, any kind of vegetation system, towards the cliff faster, or do we try to slow it down and build some kind of resilience to the changes that are expected? I'm making it sound simple, I know it's not. However, these lower elevation dry climates where we're inundating them with browsing animals, a species that's dependent on regrowth, you know, we're kind of pushing it toward the cliff faster. So I want people to be really cautious, because so much in the media, in my opinion, is misconstrued about climate change. And I think we don't have a lot of information yet. But this is not totally climate change. We play a central role in it. Of course, climate change is indirectly us, obviously. But in the direct short term, we play a central role in that. How do we separate those things? How do we sort of stack the deck in our favor a little bit more? How do we build more resilient forest systems? Let's talk about winners and losers. And again, I'm going to use Aspen as an example. You'll notice I live in the state of Utah here, if you can't see. We know pretty much about modeling climate in terms of temperature. We're much less unsure about precipitation. This is a little bit of a guessing game. There are huge fluctuations in what we think will happen based on models. We have pretty strong models on temperature. We just got to we need to point that out. So, those of you who are familiar with climate envelope models, if you've heard that term, anybody want to just nod or say anything? Am I going off in space and you've never heard of this ideas? The climate envelope model? Yeah, cool. I got at least one nod. Yeah, so this is pretty simple. if you imagined every mountain as just a pyramid, to make it very simple, as you push a system uphill with drought, the area becomes smaller. And that's all this is. It's a climate envelope. Here's what the habitat is for Populus tremuloides across the western United States, and we're going to change temperature going uphill, and we're going to have a smaller area in I think it's 2020, 2030, and 2090. There's almost none left. It's a crisis, and we're headed for disaster. That's for sure. I'm being facetious here. I'm joking. Or, your other choice, remember I said Aspen loves fire. And there's more opportunity here. As we get drier and we have more fire, again, I refer you to our media, images. Fire is always exciting, right? Stuff is burning up, people are running around screaming, you know, I don't want to make light of people being hurt or their houses ruined. However, there have homes in naturally flammable landscapes. In terms of winners and losers, Aspen's a pretty happy forest type. Things are going great. More fire, more terrain, and now we're finding out through the most recent science, of which we probably know 1% of how this plays out on landscapes, Aspen seedlings, true seedlings, new genotypes, are being found everywhere we look. We just didn't know how to look and what to look for. As botanists, and I would guess this applies to Populus tremuloides, Populus tremula, the first year or two of a seedling looks very different. You have lanceolate leaves. They're very low to the ground. It looks like a different plant. Oh crap. We don't know what we're looking at. Now we're looking at fires, and there's a couple recent papers published on this, where we're finding true Aspen seedlings, new genotypes, genotypic resilience, at almost every fire. 20 years ago, all the literature said this is a rare event. We didn't know what we were looking for. What does that mean ecologically over time and space? We're back to 1% knowledge. So there's a lot of room to move here if you want to be a scientist in that realm. However, back to this. So is it choice A, shrinking Aspen, or choice B, a flexible, responsive Aspen community to warming climate and more fire? Perhaps a boon for Aspen, and particularly if we throw in new seedlings and new genotypes and new genotypic diversity. By the way, this is just the whole field of Aspen after fire. Tens of thousands of Aspen suckers, vegetative reproduction after a fire, within 1 year, growing up to 1 meter a year. So that's a big response. We don't know. How's that going to play out? We need to build better models. This is too simple, this climate envelope models. Create a habitat and move it through time and shrink the area. However, we needed that step to learn from, right? Okay, let's talk about building better models here. So again, Aspen-centric a bit here. We have the stable type down in the lowlands. As we go up, we're all mixed in with conifers. There's lots of conifers in there, and a little bit of aspen waiting for some fires. This area, not very flammable at all, whole different ecology. But how do we build those better models? I already alluded to this. You got your habitat envelope, year and temperature change. It's pretty simplistic, pretty linear in building that. But then what if we add in functional type of forests and different forest types and how they interact? And then what if we add in not one but multiple disturbances? We get a more complex model, but we get a little bit more truth, even though we're moving ahead just incrementally, small bits at a time, as we learn this. And here's some folks, by the way, there's citations for all this stuff that I'm talking about. What irks me to no end is that media call for what a disaster something is. You name the disaster, hurricanes, floods, fires, whatever. Ecologically speaking, we never talk about what happens next. Is this going to be a forest again thriving with lots of things growing back? Or is it moving away from that completely because we've altered a system? I really wish we'd focus more of our energy on what happens next and not on the big sexy event, which is exciting, right? You know, something gets plowed over, a lot of trees are knocked down, a forest is denuded in some way, but what happens next? Same forest, different forest, no forest? We just sit at home and cry? I don't know. I just wanted to ground us a little bit here. So I have one slide where I'll bring us back to Central Europe. Because I went with Tony to, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but I'm going to take a shot at it just for comedy's sake, right? Marina Viharika. Anywhere close? However, we had a little fire. As I understand, it was human caused. We have a lot of aspen regeneration. Why does he keep saying aspen? I don't know. But a good response, and perhaps something that's been missing, maybe for decades, maybe for centuries, maybe for millennia in Europe. I don't know. You do. And then our old friend Panos, in southern Bohemia, and some wind-blown down aspen trees, the whole root system's ripped up. What will happen next? So we have these types of disturbance, obviously, in different places at different scales. I just wanted to kind of have one homegrown slide or two. Now my favorite part of the presentation. I've stopped talking for a minute, so you can start talking.
Yes.
We have one for yes.
Perhaps we could say that it's not even trees, but a tree.
Aha! Well, you're already jumping ahead 2 slides. He said perhaps we could say it's not even trees, but a tree.
Making a forest.
Is this a forest? Come on. We're having fun here. Take a chance. You botanists. We have 1 or 2 species here. We have 1 species here. Is that a forest?
Why not? How do you define forest?
He says, fair enough. Why not? I'm trying to push you in one direction, it's not working, but fair enough. He says, why not? How do you define a forest? We're going to get around to that, I think. Is this a forest?
It was a forest.
Wow, I've answered in my own mind the opposite of you guys in both slides. That's okay. There's not a right answer. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's going to be a forest again.
It will be a forest again, and then I'll take his question. How do you define the forest? Why isn't it a forest now? Because the trees aren't big?
It's a stage of the forest.
The stage of the what? The stage of the forest. Is this a forest? Let me get a little bit more refined here. This is Pando. It's 43 hectares in size, and every stem is genetically identical. It's thought to be the world's largest living organism based on dry weight mass. I've done some work there and published some papers there. Is that a forest? Or some people would say, as this gentleman did, I love this phrase because I like any phrases that mess with our minds. It's a forest of 1 tree. Sure, I don't know. The point of all of this is we need a definition. Forests change over time. They're not always big trees. They're not always dense trees. They're not always a lot of species. And to be quite honest, it's very difficult to come up with one definition that fits. And maybe the whole concept of forest is sort of arbitrary. I don't know.
So could I please ask if Odum had defined forest in his first work about ecology? Odum.
Odom?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was the first definition of the forest. I just don't remember how it sounds.
Yeah, people, there are strict definitions of the forest, right? And I guess I'm questioning those a bit and asking us to think about them a little bit more deeply. Yes, we could take a strict definition, yes, we could apply it, and yes, we could throw out the first slide. And everyone in this room would be happy. Then we'd have the answer. But the answers, in my mind, are not so clear. I'm shifting over now to our human interaction with forests. And I'm going to give you, millennia's worth of history in under 2 minutes, or something like that. And this is where I'm getting into forest versus trees. A collection of trees, in my opinion, is not a forest. I wouldn't have called that first thing a forest because it's not functioning like a forest. The species are not interacting well. We're missing a lot of species. Tens, if not hundreds of species. My bias. So, previous to the last ice age that covered a lot of the continent, we had large climate shifts and glaciation that influenced forests. And all of these other disturbances coming and going, which we know little about because it's so long ago. We have some clues from some kinds of research. Prior to what we call Euro-American settlement, Europeans coming to the to North America, we had predominantly subsistence kind of environments and subsistence level interactions with forests and all vegetation and all natural resources. The impacts were generally localized because the mechanisms were relatively small. Some people like to use terms like management and farming to describe interactions of subsistence or Aboriginal peoples. I do not accept those. Only because we have a modern connotation of what those mean. That doesn't mean they didn't do those things at localized scales, but that they influence whole entire landscapes equally. I would argue not. Over the last, since about 120 years ago, or roughly the turn of the 20th century, these European settlers really amped up their game, particularly in the western United States, and had this idea, well, the whole United States, of endless bounty. Just grab whatever you want and take it. This country is huge, and we can take everything, and it'll never have an impact because it's too big for our minds to even think about it. And they did. And the impacts were giant. One of those things, if you are unaware, that's a lot of you are aware, is to trap beaver and to make these cool felt hats and send them back to Europe. So what? We're missing a few beavers. Who cares? No, we're missing all the beavers on the whole continent. This is pretty cool hats. And that had a giant impact on forests and vegetation. And it's not just don't get me wrong here, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, this is us as humans in general. During this time there was very little regulation. Just take what you can, make money off of it, it's great. The earth is made for us to exploit and use. Then we get into this era of, wow, that was out of control. We started getting landslides. A lot of people started getting hurt. Towns were ruined, forest fires, all these kinds of things. When you went to the forest and took these things, whether it was grazing or logging, the practice of the 19th century was to light it on fire and walk away. So big impacts with the grazing and logging itself, and then starting it on fire. Yeah, that had a lot of impact. So then we're going to bring science into things. And predominantly in our country, as I think in this country, you can contradict me, we were highly, highly influenced by German agricultural forestry practices. And one individual by the name of Gifford Pinchot kind of brought our whole country into this. In fact, the predominant forest agency in the United States is in the Department of Agriculture. These are just crops. Maybe I was wrong all along about my definition of a forest. However, we adopted that. We had the science. We were in control. We're superior human beings. And we're going to just roll forward here, and we're going to control everything. Control it. We're going to put our hands around the water with dams. We're going to put our arms around the forest with plantations. We're going to control things. Humans are separate from nature, and humans are superior to nature. And then we come into kind of a more modern era, a little bit more biocentric, process-based rather than composition-based, and adaptive management in theory, right? We go down this trail, we have some prescription for a landscape, we go down this trail, if it's not working, we change direction. We know that because we monitor as we go. We have some data to show that. Sounds simple, it's not always enacted, and I wrote about that quite a while ago in this paper on disturbance ecology and forest management. This is command and control extraordinaire in the Black Hills in 1966. They physically plowed up all of the aspen because it was a weed, so we could plant more pines. Have you ever heard of anything like that in Czechia? No, probably not. Of course. And there he is putting the pines into the ground in a nice row, just like a row of crops. This is great. 2 years ago, I did an aspen workshop in the Black Hills, and it's completely reversed. At least the wildlife people hate ponderosa pine and love aspen. Oh no, how do we get it all back? Well, we're not the smartest creature maybe on Earth. I don't know. So, this is one of my favorite quotes from any piece of literature anywhere. To keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So do we go about this as farmers, as the omniscient human beings, knowing all, prescribing it and enacting it, and knowing we're right so much that we don't even have to check on what happened? We just know we're right. Or do we save all the pieces? And all the pieces come in many forms. And we don't know the value of those pieces. And value doesn't always have to mean money. These linkages are critical. And we know so little about them. To be perfectly honest and to show some humility, because it's needed, is we don't have this figured out. I laid out that history kind of like we've arrived at the promised land. No, we have a lot of confusion here. We're not quite there yet. I visited this private land, again at about 3,000 meters in elevation, so it's a slow-growing system. It takes a long time to recover, and this gentleman owns the land, and in our country you can do whatever you want. Almost. And so he heard that you could make aspen sprout and regrow for wildlife vegetation by bulldozing it. Scraping up the land, moving all the plants and animals out of there. And amazingly, he's got fields of aspen, just like a crop. This is not, well, it's not smart. It's not intelligent tinkering by any means. However, he's getting some money and some political backing to do it in other places. Maybe on public land even. So we're not there yet, and part of the reasons why we're not there is we have these sort of dichotomies. We have state versus federal land, different jurisdictions. We have private versus government land. We have managed versus wilderness areas, virtually unmanaged. We have forestry versus wildlife and a host of other disciplines. Botany, we have hydrology, we have geology, all of these things interact. But we're still playing as if we can operate as individuals, as individual disciplines. On and on. There's even more of these divisions. So I described the ideal. We're not quite there yet. You can see that people still want to take and grab what they can right now and think that we are separate from nature and do what we want with it. So finally, to the inefficient forest. Does anybody know what this emblem is here? Does that look familiar to you at all? Anybody? Okay, that's okay. It's a beer label. But the beer is called Pabst Blue Ribbon, and some friends of mine who work on beaver ecology changed it to, same first letters, process-based restoration. So this is exactly what I've been talking about most of this presentation, at least the second half. Can we restore process instead of restoring composition? Because one may follow the other. In this case, if we have perfectly engineered straight streams, we can move water from point A to point B very fast, but it has almost no ecological role. And I think, again, you're pretty familiar with that water phenomenon and streams and how they are engineered in this country. And they have been in our country quite a bit as well. However, if we can have a messy, meandering stream with sticks and beaver dams all over the place, it floods occasionally, the dams blow out occasionally, all kinds of different things happen. The ecological diversity here in this area near Logan, Utah, where I live, was tremendous. But what I really want to focus on is the forest here. We have beavers who are taking out really big trees, knocking them over, taking the limbs off that are about the size of your arm, and that's what they're building the dam with. They leave the big logs in place, and we have all these little forests of different heights around here of aspen. It's messy, it's inefficient, and its diversity is incredible. And it affects the fish diversity. It affects the wildlife and the plants. Not a bad deal, in my opinion. So, steaming into the end here, a summary of the whole thing under the phrase, the inefficient forest. The forests in the United States are highly diverse, and I gave you a fast overview of a huge area, but I wanted you to get a sense of the incredible complexity of these forests. Different types, different disturbances, different effects from climate, and so on. Scale means means a lot. Is something happening at the scale of 1 hectare or thousands of hectares? And the frequency of time as well, I should add. The forests are very dynamic if they're operating in some inefficient way, in some diverse way. It's the opposite of command and control. Dynamism. Forests are divergent. They're going in different directions at different times. They're not uniform. I like to use this analogy. It's kind of crass, you might say. But if you had a forest here and there were only 2 trees left, and you treated it like a bed. These trees are dead. There's some regeneration of aspen underneath here, but it's being browsed by wild animals. Had these trees not died, but they were alive, and we cut them both down in 1 year and walked away, would that be a good bet? It might go great. That's what betting is, right? If we go to a casino, I might win, woo! But there's a good chance I'll lose and lose everything if I put all my money on one thing. If I take a more adaptive approach, an inefficient approach, you might say, maybe I would cut one tree and put a fence around there, or protect it in some way, or put a hunter there, or somebody to scare wild animals away. Experiment, measure the difference, see how that worked. This is a simplified example with 2 trees. What if we had whole forests or whole continents? So my final slide here, the inefficient forest is messy business. If you're into control and knowing where everything's going to go, you're going to be surprised one day. We don't know if that day will be tomorrow or in 100 years. Because we're cutting off options as we go forward if things are not messy. If they are not inefficient. So the complexity of these systems, in my opinion, involves working across agency and jurisdictional boundaries, across disciplinary boundaries, and across physical boundaries. But I think it's worth the effort. And I thank you very much for listening to me.
you much for all your questions and no answers. And now
Now this side asks questions,
now
right?
we can continue the discussion.
By the way, I have some handouts over there on different Aspen aspects of Aspen ecology, some cards, business cards, stickers, some other things up here, little prizes. But you gotta ask questions.
Yeah. So please, I ask you for your question, comments. Will be in Czech. Someone will translate it. Not me. Milan?
Okay, so thank you very much for the great talk. I want to ask about this cereal forests of Aspen. So let's imagine there is a boreal forest with conifer trees like spruce or fir, and then some disturbance comes, and in the disturbed area there is a early succession of trees, which can be either birch or aspen in like mountain ecosystems of the western US, I guess. Aspen is clonal and can occupy the area for a long time, while birch is not clonal. So what's the let's say consequence of the establishment of birch versus aspen for the further development of the ecosystem? I would expect that where the space is occupied by birch, then one generation of birch leaves, then it dies, and then it's replaced by the late succession species, the conifers. But what happens in aspen, which can potentially occupy space for centuries? Well, I don't know, but I would guess so.
So he asks about, predominantly in the boreal forest, bear in mind that much of the alpine forest where aspen is, birch is not present. But it is more so in the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska. So the interaction between these two broadleaf species in early succession is essentially what you're asking. So some disturbance event comes up. If you're growing from a clonal root system, you have a huge advantage and you take the lead, right? Luckily for birch, it can germinate from seed underneath that if the density is not extreme. And so birch can come in, and then eventually the conifers come in after those two species. Birch also grows relatively fast compared to the conifers. So the succession would be aspen first, very strong response. Birch can grow under that. By the way, the fluttering of the leaves in which we get the name quaking aspen in the US and trembling aspen in Canada allows a lot of light to pass to the forest floor, and that allows the birch to germinate, but also all that biodiversity. These are the most biodiverse forest types, second only to riparian forest types. So, to your question, birch can germinate and grow well under aspen unless it's very dense. And so it essentially would be in second place. The amount of time that goes on between the initial disturbance and a follow-up disturbance would favor birch over aspen. And sometimes, and many times, you get a 50-50 proposition, let's say after 80 or 100 years. But then we start getting the spruce, the two spruce species coming in, and then they, if we go into hundreds of years, then the spruce are favored. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. So that means that that aspen is not that strong competitor. It allows other trees to like establish like below the canopy.
Yeah, its competitive advantage is it's fast out of the starting block, and it grows fast. So it takes the lead. So its competitive advantage, you might say, is over 2 or 3 or 4 decades, but not so much after that. In that mixed system, if you go to other systems where it's the stable type, which you did not ask about, it remains dominant, and other species don't come in. We're not exactly sure why that is, and we're still working that out.
I think the good evidence is in Northern Mongolia, the competition of birch and aspen. This is really good evidence how birch overcompeting aspen. It's a good sight to see.
How about some other questions? Yes?
Well, I have many questions about fires.
Good thing we're having a party afterwards. Yeah.
Well, how often do they occur? Do the people know that this interval, or why do they live there if they know that it's going to happen? Or shouldn't it be forbidden, like to build houses in those places? And how would you solve this problem?
Yeah, gosh, I wish, could you come to America and we could elect you? I like the way you're thinking. Unfortunately, we have these very strong private property rights and people can build where they like. Have you heard of the phrase building in a floodplain? The idea of building a home in the floodplain of a river is not great because it could get flooded sometime. This is the fire equivalent of that. Yet I agree with the direction you're heading and your sentiment 100%. But our politics don't. And we allow people to do that because it's really nice to live in the forest. But people are not aware that these fires can come. You asked about frequency. That depends on the amount of conifers and the species of conifers and the elevation. Generally speaking, lower elevation, more frequent, higher elevation, and higher latitude, less frequent. And so when we understand the ecology and the interacting conifer species, we can get an idea of frequency on average. You know how well averages work. Sometimes they don't add up, so to speak. You could sometimes get a fire, 2 fires in 10 years, and then maybe it'll be another 100 years or 200 years. So we can estimate the frequency, but we're not really great at communicating the message. You know? This is why we need all of you folks out there in whatever environments informing the public that systems operate, and if we go against them, we're likely to get in trouble sooner or later, whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from now or 100 years from now. So there's a great question. I don't have a complete answer, but I agree with the sentiment you're expressing.
I have a couple or 3 questions. First of all, about the fires, you have said that, well, there are pyrophilous species that like fire, and Aspen could be a candidate of this type of species because it regenerates very well after this forest fire disturbance. But precisely in the interaction, you have talked a lot about the interaction between grazing and climate change. How about the interaction of other types of environmental stressors or ecological invasions with forest fires? Because at least in Mediterranean ecosystems, it is known that even if many species, for example, are physiologically need high temperatures for the seeds to develop and to grow, but there have been studies in the communities that modeling, of course, that if the turnover of fire is too high, the species cannot regenerate again, and the system will be replaced. It will be replaced by more invasive species. And for example, what do you think about this good perspective for the aspen that it will be able to grow fantastically with forest fires? Perhaps not, because there are other. Because well, you have shown the example of the elks devouring the seedlings or the saplings, so it could not generate afterwards. And besides,
I'm about 4 questions behind you. So let me these are great questions, but let me try to address that. So he asks about different dynamics and different species and how they interact with fire, and in particular, what if the fire frequency becomes short? For example, under a climate warming scenario. There's some really good research out showing that multiple disturbances, not just fire, say fire and spruce beetle kill and avalanches, all 3 of those in short succession within a 15 or 20 year period, highly favored aspen to accept and do well. So it responds very quickly and well under multiple overlapping disturbances through time. Now you raise the really good question, even more difficult, about what if there's heavy browsers in that area too. Generally speaking, in some areas where there's too heavy a browsing, we may have no forest at all, like the one picture I showed. There is a theory out there, and I stress that it's a theory and it's used as if it's fact, that if we have enough disturbances and widespread enough, we will overwhelm the amount of browsers. That brings me back to my description of the big bet. What if we're wrong? We have some disturbances that are 4 million hectares, very large fires, and the animals were still able to eat almost all the aspen over a period of 10 years. So I don't know that that's proven, but the people who favor wildlife say there's no problem, we just need bigger fires. And the people who favor vegetation, the forest managers, are saying there's too much wildlife and we can't handle more fires. We don't have a good answer, but that's a very important concern. And if you're going to do some management that will emulate or simulate a fire, or even like prescribed fires, you better understand the browsing conditions in that area first. Otherwise, you may be making that big bet and losing. You may take down your forest, it starts to regenerate, and some animals eat all of the new regeneration, and you have no forest at all, or some completely different type. Any more questions?
Well, I have more questions.
Okay.
If there is more people.
Does anybody else want? Yes, sir.
Thank you for a nice talk. I want to ask about the last topic of inefficient forests. I wonder, you said that there is this complexity, that there are different owners, state owners, federal owners, and private owners. Here in the Czech Republic, much of the forest is owned by the state, and there is one, in fact, agency that is taking care of them, and presently not very open to nature-friendly management. So I wonder what is your experience in Utah or generally in the United States, whether these state and federal owners are more open to nature-friendly management than private owners. How this?
Yeah, that's a nice question, an elegant question. I appreciate that. So he asks about, I think maybe inadvertently asking if there are some entities, state, private, federal, that manage more similarly to the way state management is done in Czechia or not. But basically our federal government and federally run forests are under a mandate to manage at the ecosystem kind of approach. That doesn't mean they do it right and effectively all the time, but they have more of a mandate, and it's a bureaucracy, as Tony is very familiar with, that moves slow and clumsily. Not always great. So, but that's what they have to go through, a lot of checks, and they have to have public input and all of these things. The state governments very much still operate in the command and control. How much money can we make quickly? And this applies way beyond forests, to water, to roads, to all kinds of land development, to farming. They want to make money quick, and so they're not as concerned with natural management. And some of the state-owned land has a mandate to make as much money as you can right now. It's not very conducive to ecological management at all. And so we have really different, you might say, polar pulling. And it's different with different ownership. The private land ownership can do almost whatever they want, but interestingly, a lot of private landowners are very interested in natural management now. And they even have nature conservation, I can't remember the term right now, but basically a legal document that can last 100 years or more that says we will manage this land in perpetuity for biological diversity. And they have to do that legally, but they do it voluntarily. So it runs a whole gamut, but our state governments run more similarly, I think, to how forests may be managed in Czechia. But I don't know all of the nuances of what governs forests in this country. maybe I'll learn some more about that at the party too. You tell them, there's.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you for the nice compliment. Anyone? Oh, yes, in the back?
Sorry, I missed the start of the presentation. But it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you. I have a question. Do you have in America like some blockers for to not spreading of fire? I know that, for example, in Spain they have like some lanes or gaps in the forests between one forest and two forests. Do you have also some something like that?
No, not so much, but the basis of firefighting, I don't like that term when I'm in a fight with fire. I usually lose. But the basis of that is making these at the time the fire's burning. But we have very few, if any, of those in place. Interestingly, in the interest of humans, we can manage more intensively near homes for aspen, because aspen is sort of an asbestos forest, meaning it doesn't burn well. So one strategy may be to make a blocker, in your words, using certain species that are less flammable. Remember, I said aspen is not flammable, but it responds well after fire. So it's kind of a conundrum there, and you've got to think about how that might work. But no, we don't have big blockers out there or gaps in the forest purposely, because basically the landscape is too large and we'd be trying to guess where fires might be going. Yeah, thank you. One more?
We keep talking about fire management. So in your last answers, there was always fire management involved. And when I think about fire management in North America, or at least in the Pacific Northwest, I'm wondering what we can learn from the fire management that was done before the arrival of Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, maybe we have to adapt, because now there's a different level of browsing pressure or stuff like that. There are much more people now involved in living in the country. But what do you think can we learn from those times?
For Aboriginal peoples?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So she asks about what we might learn from Aboriginal peoples in terms of fire management. And I told earlier in the presentation I wasn't super comfortable with the word management in the context of Aboriginals, but that's fine. I know what you mean. That's fine. But I still want to answer your question. Yeah.
I would just say I'm comfortable with the term of management.
Cool. That's cool. No problem. So what the center of the question is, what can we learn from that? And I think what we can learn is that closer to settlements in more localized areas, Aboriginal peoples use fires in certain landscapes that would burn. You can't use fire in landscapes that don't burn well. For example, in the west side of the Cascade Mountains, fire is super infrequent there. It's so wet. Similarly with aspen, you can't burn aspen much of the year, if at all. So that's out. But in patchy situations, on the west slope in California, Aboriginal peoples use fire more intensively to manage nut crops in certain species of oaks, for example, in smaller patches and groups. And the key here is they moved around, much like that photo I showed at a little different scale of the impacts of beaver on the aspen forest. So you had a lot of patches of different sizes and heights that were affected by some disturbance, in that case beaver. But that could be applied reasonably to how Aboriginal peoples used fire in the North American continent. They used it judiciously, they used it strategically, and they used it locally. Not complete landscapes, not landscapes that don't burn well. You know, in high elevations and high latitudes, 9 years out of 10 you can't get a fire to burn. Maybe it's more like 99 years out of 100. But that 1 year, it will burn very strong. Or maybe, you know, it's 200 or 300 or 400 years between fires. So use it where you can, move around a lot, use it strategically, and there's a lot we can learn, would be my answer. I made it a little longer and I didn't need to editorialize about management. Sorry about that. I'm going to take a break. Is that okay? And I'd be happy to talk to anybody afterwards. And be sure to pick up these things here and some little souvenirs if you wish.